Now what we're doing is we're taking what we did in the last lesson, the two parts, because we had one where we're multiplying two things together that equals 0. One of them must be 0, so we split them up. And at the end of the lesson, we worked with dealing with greatest common factor. Now we're going to use those things not at the same time, but in combination to be able to solve these. So when we look at this here, we have 2x squared plus 8x equals 0. And what I want to do is I want to find out what value of x is going to make this 0. And to be able to do that, we're going to use greatest common factor. We're going to see what is the biggest thing I can divide into both of these here. And the first thing we do is we look at the numbers. What is the biggest number that will divide into both 2 and 8? 2, because 2 will divide into 2 and 2 will divide into 8, yes? So the greatest common factor between 2x squared and 8x, the number is going to be 2. Between 2 and 8, the greatest common factor is 2. Now we need to see what is the greatest common factor between x squared and x. How many x's can I take out of x squared and x? What is the most I can? Because with x squared, how many do I have? With x, how many do I have? Right, because of the 8x, x to the first power, there's only one of them there. I can only take one out of both. Because if I take more than one away from both, well, 8x doesn't have two x's to give. It only has, right, it would go below 0. So the most I can take out of both of these terms is just 2x. And we're going to factor that out. And what we're essentially doing is we're dividing each term by 2x. Well, 2 divided by 2 is 1. X squared divided by x. If I take x squared divided by x, it's the same as removing an x from it. So we have 1x. Plus, because we're not dividing by a negative, 8 divided by 2 is x divided by x is 1. It simplifies to 1. So we would just have 4 times 1, or just 4. Any questions on any of this here? So what we're left with is, so we have 2x times x plus 4, yes? Well, wait a minute. When I factored that out, I ended up coming up with two things being multiplied together that equal 0. And since I have two things multiplied together to equal 0, it means one of them has to be 0. So we can split them up. 2x is equal to 0, or x plus 4 is equal to 0. One of them has to be 0. And we can solve. Well, here we can divide both sides by 2. And we get x is equal to 0. So 0 divided by 2 is 0. Now with our x plus 4, we need 2. X is equal to negative 4. So what two values of x will make this 0? 0 and negative 4. And that's it. Any questions on this here? Okay, let's look at this one here. Six n squared equals 15n. Now on all of these that we've been doing, we've been solving them when they equaled what? 0. Is this equal to 0? Now, and whenever we have a higher degree polynomial, so n squared, whenever we have a variable to a power greater than 1, so essentially if we have a squared or a cubed or any higher exponent, we need to get everything on the same side. We want this set equal to 0. There are one or two exceptions, but we won't cover those here. So what we need to do first is subtract 15n from both sides. Now our 15n minus 15n will become 0. Now is 6n squared and 15n like terms? Well, no, because we have n squared and n. They're not like terms. So it'll just be 6n squared minus 15n. And now we're going to do what we just did. We're going to find out what the greatest common factor between these two is. What we can factor out. So looking at 6 and 15, what is the biggest number that will divide into both 6 and 15? 3. Mm-hmm. 3. Because unfortunately 15 won't divide by 2 and give us a whole number. So 3 is the biggest number. Now what is the most variables that we can pull out of between n squared and n? We can only pull out 1. So we can factor that out. So if I factor 3n out of 6n squared, or 6 divided by 3 is? It would just be 2n. Because we're essentially dividing that out. 6 divided by 3 is 2. N divided by n squared would be just n, because we're taking 1 away. Minus, because the only reason that the signs would change is if we're dividing by a negative. But we're dividing by a positive, so the signs don't change. 15 divided by 3 is? And n divided by n would simplify out completely. Now, if you're not sure that you got these right, we can always multiply them back out and see if we get back where we start. Because 3n times 2n, well, 3 times 2 is? 6. N times n is? N squared, that's where we started, yes? 3 times negative 5 is? And we have our n. So essentially, we're just doing, if we want to check it, we can multiply back through, and it would get us back to where we start, if we factored it correctly. Any questions on how we got to this point here? Well, I have two things multiplied together to equal 0. It means one of them has to be 3n equals 0. What's the value of n going to be? Because I have two things multiplied together equal 0. One of them has to be 0. And it can't be 3. Because the only number that we can multiply 3 by and get 0 is 0. Now we do need to solve the other one, 2n minus 5. So what can we do first? We can add 5 to both sides. Because negative 5 plus 5 would cancel, telling us 2n is equal to, and then what? 5/2. So 5/2 and 0 are our two answers. They're the two values of n that will make this function equal 0. Mm-hmm. 3n. Yeah. That's all the GCF is going to be. Now, On the next one here, we won't do, so the GCF that I squared, or drew a box around, we don't have to do that step. I do that, I'm drawing that in so we can kind of see what it is. But if we know what it is and kind of work through it, we don't have to do that. So let's look at it this way here. So it's equal to 0, yes? Everything's on the same side. So we can look at the greatest common factor. So what is the greatest common factor? What is the biggest number I can divide into both 4 and 12? 4. 4 will divide into 4, and 12 is divisible by 4. So what is the biggest variable that I can factor out? X is the biggest one I can pull out of both. So our greatest common factor for these two is 4x. Questions on this here so far? Now let's see what would be left inside. So for our first term, 4 divided by 4 is x squared divided by x. So just leave us with x, because our 4 over 4 would simplify. X squared over x would simplify to x. Plus 12 divided by 4 is x divided by x is 1, so it's gone, so we just have 3. Any questions on this here? Well, we have two things multiplied together that equal 0, so one of them must be 0. So either 4x is equal to 0 or x plus 3 is equal to 0. So 4x equal to 0, well, x has to be 0. How about this here? We subtract 3. We get x is equal to -3. Any questions on this here? Any questions on anything we've done so far? Are you ready for the next one? Can y'all take a guess at what one of the values of a is possibly going to be? 0. Have y'all noticed that yet? That 0 has shown up as a solution every single time for today? And that's going to work out because do we have any term that doesn't have a in these equations? Well, no, we don't have a constant term. We don't just have plus 4, right? So if we want these things to be 0, well, if I plug 0 into every variable, everything is going to 0 out, yes? So it kind of works out that if there's no constant terms in this, most likely 0 is going to be a solution. And it is for this one here. So when we look at this here, well, it's not equal to 0, correct? So it'd be nice if it is, and we need to make it equal to 0. Now there's two things that there's one of two things that we can do. We can either move the 10a squared over to the 8a, or we can move the 8a over the 10a squared. Which direction do y'all want to move? Personally, I like keeping the a squared, the term with the biggest exponent, positive, because it's a little bit easier to work with. So right now, is the term in front of a squared positive? No. So if I move it over to the 8a, how would I move it? What would we have to do to both sides? So how would we move the 10a squared over to the other side? What would we do to both sides? We would? Right, I would add 10a squared to both sides, yes? Well, these here would cancel because negative 10 plus 10 is 0, yes? So we get 0 equals, I'm going to put it in front, 10a squared plus 8a, because I like having it in standard form, biggest exponents going first. Well, is the term in front of a squared positive now? Well, yeah. And I try to do that especially when you guys get to Algebra 2, when we deal, yes, sir?
I have a question. When you put 0 equals 10a plus 10a, would that still be that 10a squared?
It wouldn't, because 10a plus 10a, 10 plus 10 is 20a. And 20a is not going to give us the exact same thing as 10a squared. Now, it might work for 2. Yeah, because 20 times 4 is, or 20 times 2 is 40. 2 squared is, 4 times 10 is, it works. Now, if we said 3, 3 times 20 is 60. 3 squared is, and 9 times 10 is. So 10a squared is actually going to increase at a faster rate than 20a. And it's mainly dealing with the fact that a squared is considered kind of more exponential. It's going to increase at a faster rate than just a. So they're a little bit different. Any other questions? So I try to keep the biggest term positive, and it will work out, especially when you get in Algebra 2, working that way, because otherwise we're going to have to deal with negatives. So let's look at this here. What is the biggest number, or the greatest common factor between 10 and 8? What's the biggest number I can divide into both 10 and 8? 2. 2 is going to be the biggest number. And what about our a's? It's the biggest variable I can take out of both. Well, just a, because 8a only has 1, so I can only pull out 1. We can only pull out, the most we can pull out is whichever one has the least. So let's go on and divide. Well, 10 divided by 2 is 5. A squared divided by a would be a plus 4. And it would just be 4 because our a divided by a is 1 that simplifies out completely. Now, since we have two things multiplied together to equal 0, it means one of them must be 0. Well, 2 times a equals 0 is really telling me a is 0. Well, we already knew a was going to be 0 as one of our answers. We knew that from the beginning. Now, 5a plus 4, we still need to solve. What can we do first? We can subtract 4 from both sides. These will cancel, telling us that 5a is equal to negative 4. And then what? We would divide both sides by 5, telling us a is equal to negative 4 fifths. Any questions on any of this here? How do we feel about these here? You feel comfortable with these here? So it's not a huge step, but it is a little bit different. Now, as I said, I'm only going to make one more point, and then I'm going to let y'all work on the assignment. Any assignments that you have finished. One of these here may be helpful if I can actually write. What is one of the solutions we know for all three of these here? Because we only have variables. Because here I can even check it. 0 squared plus 5 times 0 equals 0. Well, 0 times itself is still 0. 5 times 0 is, and 0 plus 0 is 0. Here, 3 times 0 squared minus 9 times 0. Well, that's just going to be 0 minus 0 equals 0. 4 times 0 squared minus is equal to 2 times 0. 0 is equal to 0. It works. Because whenever we don't have a constant term, it works out just fine. And will we always have this? Well, no. Because we can deal with equations like this here, and we will eventually get there. Because if we try to plug 0 in, well, 0 squared is 0. 4 times 0 is 0. Well, 0 plus 4 is 4, but 4 is not equal to 0. So once we get that constant term, the number without a variable, it does not work as well. So that is all we're going to do for